Hi, my name is Ben, and today I'll be talking about my visit to a Catholic Mass. Now, I attend St. Louis University, which is a Jesuit university, so I've been to one Catholic Mass in the past on campus, but other than that, this was really my first experience with it. Today, I'll be talking about the service itself, and I'll go into some detail about how it differed from other experiences that I've had. I'll also just discuss a few questions that I had after leaving the service. When I arrived shortly before the processional, and so because I didn't have much time, I just got in, found a pew on my own towards the back because I didn't know anyone, and very shortly thereafter the processional started. Now when the processional started, the entire congregation got very, very quiet, which was very different from my experience at Methodist services, in which people will talk throughout the procession, and even if there's an opening hymn, sometimes they'll talk during that. So I was a little bit surprised by this. However, this was very similar to Lutheran services that I've been to, a little bit more somber, a little bit more, shall we say, serious. Now, we got throughout the service, and there were many hymns and many call responses. Now, most of the hymns, of course, I was able to find in the hymnal and participate in without much of a problem. The same was true for some of the call responses, but some of the call responses were more memorized, and so I just kind of stood there and did my best not to stick out too much. Now, after some of the hymns and the call responses, the priest gave some words from the Bible, a few more call responses, and then went into more detail talking about the scripture that he had read from. Now, this again was very similar to both Methodist and Lutheran services that I've been to. It was essentially a sermon and then a discussion afterward. Now, after that, we went into the Lord's Prayer, and the version that I know is the Methodist version, which varies a little bit from the Catholic version, but I was able to follow along for the most part. It, however, seemed very similar to the Lutheran Lord's Prayer, so I looked it up, and really the only difference between the Lutheran and the Catholic Lord's Prayer is that the Lutherans add, "For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever," at the very end, which is the same as the Methodist, so for whatever reason, the Catholics don't have that in their Lord's Prayer. After that, we got to the passing of the peace, and so I shook hands with a few people around me, but it was a very quick encounter. Nobody went out of their way to say hi to me, and that was pretty much the end of it. Again, this was very different from my experiences at having been to Methodist services, where people really go out of their way to try to, welcome people into the fold, and try to introduce themselves to those that they don't recognize. So I wouldn't say that it was cold. It just wasn't quite as warm and friendly as I've gotten at Methodist services. Now, when it got to the time of the taking of the communion, I was able to again participate in the hymns or the responses rather. And having been to a Catholic Mass before and attending a Catholic university, I knew that I wouldn't be able to actually partake in communion as a non-Catholic. But I did go ahead and go up and cross my arms to get the blessing. When I went up, I got a few looks from people that knew that I wasn't a member of the church, and I think perhaps they were worried that I was going to try to take communion. So luckily, since I knew, it really passed without incident. Now, I felt sort of uncomfortable at this service, mainly because I, haven't been to churches much in the past, and especially because this service was a lot more, shall we say, conservative than services I've been to, especially Methodist conservatives. Um, or Methodist services. Now, another part of it was that because the call responses were mostly memorized, I didn't really know what to say, and I never really feel comfortable being the odd person out that doesn't know what they're doing. But that just kind of comes with the territory, I suppose. Now, the congregation, like I said, was not unfriendly, but just wasn't quite as warm and inviting as the different Methodist services that I've been to. I've been to a few different Methodist churches, and all of them were just a lot more warm and welcoming and a little bit more outgoing. Also, the service was a little bit more dry and conservative than I'm used to, and so I was just a little surprised by that. Now, though similar, there were a few noticeable differences through the Mass from Methodist and Lutheran services that I've talked about, and it left me with a few questions. My first one was I was wondering why it is that Catholics don't allow non-Catholics to partake in communion. So I looked it up, and according to some U.S. bishops, it is because Catholics believe that the celebration of the Eucharist is a sign of the reality of the oneness of faith, life, and worship. Members of those churches with whom we are not yet fully united are ordinarily not admitted to communion. It basically goes on to say that receiving communion as a non-Catholic requires the permission of a diocesan bishop, so you have to go pretty high up the chain before you're even allowed to take communion as a non-Catholic. Now, this is very different from Methodist worship. At Methodist worship, pretty much anybody is invited to partake in communion, whether you be Methodist, Christian of a different denomination, or completely non-Christian. And so that was very different and something that just stuck out to me a little bit. I was curious to see if the Catholics were the only ones that have a closed communion, and as it turns out, actually even a few Lutheran churches do have closed communion, they're just not the churches that I've been to, as well as some Baptist churches. Now, after this visit, I will say that as awkward as some of it was, I would definitely recommend to anybody who hasn't been to a service differing from their own faith or denomination, I would really recommend that you do so because it was eye-opening and it really allows you to see the similarities and differences and just, what different people believe and how they go about their faith.